You were never supposed to find that. Lauren's voice came from behind me, tight and controlled, but not fast enough to hide the crack in it. And in that moment, standing in the dim light of the hallway with a single envelope in my hand, I realized something in this house had been carefully buried long before I ever thought to start digging. I turned slowly, the letter still unopened between my fingers, its paper yellowed and soft at the edges, like it had been waiting for decades just to be touched again, and I watched my daughter-in-law's expression shift from surprise to something colder, something calculating. The kind of look I had learned, over the past few years, meant she was already thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. I was just cleaning, I said, my voice steady, quieter than I felt, because I had spent a lifetime learning that raising your voice never gave you more power. It only showed people where you were weakest, and Lauren knew that too. She always knew where to look. The attic had been untouched since Thomas passed 6 months ago, a place filled with boxes I hadn't had the strength to go through, each one holding pieces of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. And yet this morning, something had pulled me up there, something small and persistent, like a memory I couldn't quite place, and I had found the box tucked behind a stack of old winter coats, sealed but not locked, as if whoever hid it believed no one would ever bother to look that far. Inside were dozens of letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon, the kind people used to use when words meant more because they couldn't be sent with a click, and I had only taken one before I heard her footsteps on the stairs. You shouldn't go through things that aren't yours, Lauren said now, stepping closer, her heels soft against the hardwood, her tone returning to that polished calm she wore like a second skin, but her eyes kept flicking to the letter in my hand, and that told me more than anything she could have said out loud. Not yours. The words settled in my chest in a way that felt familiar, like hearing something you've been told in a dozen different ways, without anyone ever saying it directly, and I almost smiled, because at 67, you learn to recognize when a sentence is really a boundary someone else is trying to draw around your own life. I looked down at the envelope, at the handwriting I hadn't seen in years, elegant and deliberate, unmistakably Thomas's, and beneath his name, a line that made my fingers tighten just slightly. She must never know. For a moment, the house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath with me, and I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant sound of a car passing on the street, ordinary noises that suddenly felt out of place against the weight of something that had been hidden for 40 years. I think, I said slowly, lifting my eyes back to Lauren, that if it's in my house, it's at least worth understanding. She held my gaze for a second too long, and in that pause, something unspoken passed between us, something sharp and undeniable, and then she gave a small, practiced smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Some things are better left in the past, she replied, and there it was again, that careful control, that gentle push to close a door I had only just opened, but it was too late for that. Because standing there, with that letter in my hand and that sentence echoing in my mind, I understood something with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Whatever had been hidden in those pages, Lauren already knew about it, and more importantly, she didn't want me to know. And that was all I needed. I did not open the letter right away. Instead, I walked past Lauren as if nothing had changed, as if the weight of that single sentence had not just shifted something inside me that had been still for years, and I carried the envelope down the hallway, past the family photos that suddenly felt staged, like moments carefully chosen to tell a story that might not have been entirely true. I could feel her watching me, not moving, not speaking, and that silence said more than any argument ever could. When I reached the kitchen, I set the letter on the counter beside the sink and turned on the faucet, letting the water run longer than necessary, giving myself a reason to pause, to think, to breathe without letting it show on my face. For the past 6 months, since Thomas passed, the house had belonged more to routine than to memory. Mornings were quiet, afternoons stretched longer than they used to, and evenings were often spent alone in the living room, the television on low just to fill the space. Daniel called when he could, which was less often than I told myself was reasonable, and when he visited, Lauren was always there, guiding the conversation, smoothing over pauses before they could become questions. I had told myself it was just the way things were now, that time changed people, that grief made distance feel normal, but standing there with that letter within reach, I began to see those moments differently, like pieces of something I had not wanted to put together. I turned off the water and dried my hands slowly, deliberately, then picked up the envelope again, tracing the edge where it had been sealed decades ago, wondering how many times it had been moved, hidden, protected from being found. The handwriting was steady, unmistakable, and for a brief moment, I was no longer in the present but back in a time when Thomas would sit at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand, writing things he never said out loud, believing that putting words on paper somehow made them safer. I opened the letter carefully, not tearing the paper, just easing it apart as if it might fall apart if I rushed it, and unfolded the page inside. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear, still intentional, still carrying a weight that did not belong to something ordinary. It was not addressed to me. That was the first thing I noticed, and it settled into me quietly, like a truth that did not need to be announced to be understood. There was no name at the top, no greeting, just a sentence written with a kind of urgency that felt out of place for a man who had always been measured in everything he did. He wrote about timing, about choices, about things that could not be undone once they were known, and as I read, I realized this was not a letter meant to be remembered. It was a letter meant to be hidden. I lowered the page slightly, my eyes moving back to that single line again, the one that had already begun to echo in my mind as if it belonged there. She must never know. I did not need to ask who she was. I understood that part without effort, and what surprised me was not the realization itself, but how calm it felt settling into place. I folded the letter neatly, the same way it had been before, and slipped it back into the envelope, then placed it on the counter exactly where it had been, as if nothing had happened at all. Upstairs, I could hear a faint movement, the soft sound of a door closing, and I knew Lauren was giving me space, or at least pretending to, but now I understood that space differently. It was not distance. It was control. And for the first time in a long time, I decided I did not need to confront anything yet. Not until I understood everything. Because whatever had been hidden in that attic for 40 years, it was not just a secret from the past. It was something that was still shaping the present, and I had a feeling I had only just begun to see how deep it went. That night, I did not mention the letter, not at dinner, not when Daniel asked if I needed anything from the store, and not even when Lauren placed a neatly folded napkin beside my plate, as if she were setting a stage rather than a table, because I had already learned that the most dangerous thing you can do when someone is hiding something is to let them believe you are still in the dark. The three of us sat in the dining room where I had eaten thousands of meals over the years, but the space felt different now, smaller in a way that had nothing to do with the walls and everything to do with what was not being said between us. Daniel talked about work, about a new client, about numbers and schedules and things that filled silence without meaning anything, and I listened the way I always had, nodding at the right moments, asking simple questions, keeping everything smooth, because that had always been my role in this family, the one who made things easier, quieter, more manageable. Lauren barely spoke, but she watched, and I noticed the way her eyes moved between me and the table, never quite settling, as if she were waiting for something that had not happened yet. I wondered how long she had been waiting, how many times she had passed that attic door knowing what was inside, knowing what had to stay hidden. When I reached for my glass, I saw her glance at my hands, just for a second, and then look away, and that small movement told me more than any confession ever could. She was not afraid of what I had read. She was afraid of what I might do next. I set the glass down gently and looked at her, holding the moment just long enough to feel it shift, and then I spoke in a tone so calm it almost surprised me. I asked her if she had ever gone through the boxes upstairs, the ones that had been there for years, untouched and forgotten. It was a simple question, the kind that could be answered without thought, but I watched the way her shoulders stiffened before she answered, the way her smile came just a fraction too late. She said no, of course not, that she respected my space, that she would never go through things that were not hers, and the words sounded familiar, almost rehearsed, echoing what she had told me earlier that day, but now I could hear the intention behind them, the careful shaping of a boundary she wanted me to accept without question. Daniel looked between us, confused, not because he sensed anything deeper, but because he had never been taught to look for what was not obvious. He had always taken things at face value, and I realized then that whatever had been hidden for 40 years had not been meant for him either. After dinner, Lauren cleared the plates before I could stand, moving quickly, efficiently, as if she needed to keep her hands busy, and I let her, because watching her was becoming more valuable than anything she could say. When she carried the dishes to the kitchen, I followed a few seconds later, not to help, but to observe, and I saw the way she paused at the counter, her gaze dropping to the exact spot where I had left the letter earlier, now empty, and for a brief moment, her composure slipped. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there, and it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. She knew the letters existed. She knew what they meant. And more importantly, she believed she still had control over what happened next. I turned away before she could notice me watching, picking up a dish towel and folding it slowly, deliberately, giving her time to recover, because there was no need to confront anything yet. Not when the truth was already beginning to reveal itself in the spaces between our words, in the pauses that stretched just a little too long, in the careful way she moved through a house she thought she understood completely. Later, when I returned to my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the envelope again, now resting in the drawer beside me, hidden but no longer forgotten, and I realized that for the first time since Thomas passed, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what had been taken from me long before I ever knew it was gone. I woke up before sunrise, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already begun to move ahead of me, piecing together fragments that no longer felt random. And for a moment, I lay still in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the same house I had lived in for over 3 decades, now filled with corners that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The drawer beside me held the letter, and I could feel its presence without touching it, like a thought that refused to fade no matter how carefully you tried to set it aside. I reached for it slowly, not out of urgency, but with a kind of deliberate patience I had not allowed myself in years, and when I unfolded the page again, I read it differently this time, not as a memory, but as a clue. The words about timing and choices no longer sounded abstract. They sounded precise, intentional, as if they had been written with a specific future in mind, a future where someone would either understand or never know at all. I stood and walked to the window, letting the early morning light fall across the paper, revealing details I had missed before, the slight pressure in the pen strokes, the way certain words were written more firmly than others, and I realized Thomas had not written this casually. He had written it carefully, as if he knew it would matter one day, just not to whom. Downstairs, I could hear movement, the faint clink of a coffee cup, the low sound of cabinet doors opening and closing, and I knew Lauren was already awake, already moving through her routine, already controlling the rhythm of the house the way she always did. I folded the letter again and slipped it into the pocket of my robe, not to hide it, but to keep it close, because something told me I would need it sooner than I expected. When I stepped into the hallway, the air felt cooler, sharper, like the house itself had shifted overnight, and as I made my way down the stairs, I saw Lauren standing at the kitchen counter, her back straight, her movements precise, pouring coffee into 2 cups as if she had been doing it her entire life, as if this place belonged to her in a way that had nothing to do with time. She turned when she heard me, her expression already composed, already ready, and she offered a small smile that did not ask questions, only acknowledged presence. I returned it just as calmly, taking a seat at the table without speaking, letting the silence settle between us the way it had the night before. Only now it felt heavier, more deliberate. She placed a cup in front of me and sat across from me, her fingers resting lightly around her own mug, her eyes steady, observant, waiting. I took a sip of coffee and set the cup down, then asked her, in the same quiet tone I had used the night before, if she had ever met any of Thomas's old friends, the ones from before Daniel was born. It was not a question that should have mattered, not one that should have carried weight, but I watched the way her fingers tightened slightly around the ceramic, the way her gaze shifted for just a fraction of a second before returning to mine. She said no, that Thomas had not talked much about his past, that everything important to him had been right here, in this house, with this family, and the words were smooth, well placed, but they did not match the letter in my pocket, the one that spoke of something outside this life, something separate, something hidden. I nodded as if I accepted her answer, as if there was nothing more to consider, and for a moment, the room returned to stillness, the kind that looks peaceful from the outside but feels different when you are sitting inside it. After a few seconds, she stood, taking her cup with her, and moved toward the sink, turning her back to me in a way that seemed casual but felt intentional, as if she was choosing not to see what I might do next. I watched her quietly, noticing how carefully she placed the cup down, how she adjusted the position of a dish on the counter that did not need adjusting, how every movement carried a kind of controlled precision that now felt less like habit and more like strategy. And in that moment, I understood something with complete clarity. Whatever had been written in those letters, whatever had been hidden for 40 years, Lauren was not just aware of it. She had built her place in this house around it. And that meant the truth was not just in the past. It was still very much alive, moving quietly through the present, shaping everything I had once believed without ever asking for permission. I did not go back to the attic that morning, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I had already learned that answers reveal themselves more clearly when you stop chasing them and start watching the people who are trying to keep them hidden. Instead, I left the house just after 9, taking my coat even though the air was mild, walking slowly down the street I had known for decades, past the same houses, the same trimmed lawns, the same neighbors who waved without really seeing you. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself think without interruption. Thomas had always been a man of routine, predictable in the way he moved through life, steady in ways that made everything feel safe. And yet the letter in my pocket did not belong to that version of him. It belonged to someone else, someone who had made decisions quietly, deliberately, without ever letting them reach the surface of our life together. I turned the corner toward the small office building where Martin Green still worked, the same attorney who had handled Thomas's affairs after he passed. And for a moment I hesitated at the door, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once I stepped inside, whatever I found would not be something I could set aside again. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish, the kind of place where everything was kept in order, where nothing was left to chance. And when Martin looked up and saw me, his expression shifted from polite surprise to something more thoughtful, as if he had been expecting a different version of this moment. He asked how I was doing, in the careful way people do when they are not sure how much truth you are willing to give, and I answered just as carefully, telling him I was managing, that things were settling, that I had come with a simple question. I placed the letter on his desk, not sliding it toward him, just setting it down between us, and watched the way his eyes moved to the handwriting before he even reached for it. He recognized it immediately. That much was clear. He did not say anything at first, just unfolded the paper slowly, reading it in silence, his expression tightening in a way that told me this was not something new to him. When he finished, he set the letter down with more care than necessary, his fingers lingering on the edge as if he were deciding how much to say. I did not rush him. I had already waited 40 years without knowing it. A few more seconds would not change anything. Finally, he looked at me and asked where I had found it, and I told him the truth, that it had been in a box upstairs, hidden but not destroyed, preserved in a way that suggested intention, not forgetfulness. He nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, the room felt heavier, like it was holding something that had been waiting to be spoken. He said Thomas had come to him many years ago, long before Daniel was born, with documents that required discretion, arrangements that were meant to remain separate from the life he had built afterward. And as he spoke, I felt the pieces begin to align in a way that was both precise and unsettling. There had been another account, another set of assets, placed under a structure that would only be revealed under specific conditions, and those conditions had never been met, at least not until recently. I asked him what had changed, and he hesitated again, just for a moment, before answering in a tone that was quieter than before. He said someone had come to see him 2 years ago, asking questions about those arrangements, asking in a way that suggested they already knew where to look. I did not need to ask who. I already understood. Lauren had not just discovered the truth. She had gone looking for it. I stood there, my hands resting lightly against the edge of his desk, and realized that everything I had begun to suspect was only the surface of something much deeper. Because if Lauren had known about those hidden assets, if she had taken steps to understand them before I ever knew they existed, then this was not just about the past. It was about planning. It was about positioning. And most of all, it was about control. I did not ask Martin any more questions after that, not because I had nothing left to say, but because I understood that the rest of the answers were not sitting in his office, neatly filed and ready to be handed over. They were waiting somewhere else, in the choices people had made when they thought I would never notice. And as I stepped outside into the late morning light, I felt something settle inside me that had been restless for years, a kind of quiet clarity that does not come from knowing everything, but from finally knowing enough. The walk back home felt different from the one I had taken earlier, not longer or shorter, but sharper, as if every detail along the way had come into focus in a way it never had before. The sound of gravel under my shoes, the distant hum of traffic, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, all of it grounding me in the present while my mind moved carefully through the past, placing each new piece where it belonged. Lauren had not stumbled into this by accident. She had gone to Martin. She had asked the right questions. She had known where to look. That meant she had been searching long before I ever found the letters, long before Thomas passed, possibly even before Daniel and I noticed anything had begun to change. And that realization did not make me angry. It made me precise. When I reached the house, I paused at the front door for a moment, my hand resting on the handle, not hesitating, just allowing myself to step fully into the version of this place I now understood I had been living in without seeing. Inside, everything looked exactly the same furniture, the same arrangement, the same quiet order that had always defined our home, and yet none of it felt quite as familiar as it had before. Lauren was in the living room, sitting with a tablet in her lap, her posture relaxed in a way that might have seemed natural to anyone who did not know what to look for, but I did not need to see tension to recognize control anymore. She looked up as I entered, her expression softening into that same measured warmth, the one that had never quite convinced me, but had always been just enough to avoid question. She asked how my morning had been, and I answered simply, telling her I had taken a walk, that the weather was nice, that I had enjoyed the quiet, and I watched as she nodded, accepting the surface of my words without pressing deeper, because she believed that if I had discovered anything, I would have shown it already. That was her mistake. I moved past her into the kitchen, placing my keys on the counter with a soft, deliberate sound, then opened the cabinet and took out a glass, filling it with water as if nothing at all had shifted between us. From where I stood, I could see her reflection faintly in the window, the way she angled her head slightly, listening without appearing to listen, always gathering information even in silence. And I realized then that the only way to understand the full extent of what she had done was to let her continue exactly as she had been. No confrontation, no accusation, just observation. Later that afternoon, Daniel came home earlier than usual, his footsteps heavier than they used to be, his presence filling the house in a way that felt both familiar and distant at the same time. And as he greeted me, I studied him more carefully than I had in years. Noticing the small things I had overlooked, the way he avoided direct eye contact when certain topics came up, the way his answers sometimes arrived a fraction too quickly, as if they had been prepared in advance. When we sat together in the living room, I asked him about his work, about his plans, about ordinary things that required ordinary answers, and he responded easily, comfortably, unaware that I was no longer listening for what he said, but for what he did not say. Lauren joined us a few minutes later, taking her usual place beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture that seemed affectionate, but now felt more like placement, like positioning. And as the conversation moved forward, I began to see the pattern more clearly than ever before. She guided. He followed. Not completely, not obviously, but enough that it shaped the direction of everything around them. I excused myself after a while, not because I was tired, but because I had seen enough for the day, and as I returned to my room, closing the door softly behind me, I reached into my pocket and took out the letter again, holding it for a moment before placing it back in the drawer. There were more letters upstairs, more answers waiting, but I did not need to rush, because for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer trying to catch up to the truth. I was moving ahead of it, quietly, carefully, in a way no one in this house was expecting. That evening, I went back to the attic, not with hesitation, but with intention, carrying a small box with me so I would not have to make multiple trips, because there was no longer any reason to pretend those letters did not belong to me. The air up there was still and dry, filled with the faint scent of old paper and wood, and as I knelt beside the place where I had first found them, I noticed something I had missed before. The way the box had been positioned just slightly out of alignment with everything else, not carelessly hidden, but deliberately placed so it would not be found unless someone was truly looking. I opened it again and lifted the bundle of letters, feeling the weight of them in my hands, heavier now that I understood they were not just remnants of the past, but pieces of a story that had been kept from me by design. I brought them downstairs one by one, moving quietly through the house, aware of every sound, every shift of the floor beneath my feet, but not concerned about being seen, because if Lauren noticed, I wanted her to notice just enough to begin wondering what I knew. In my room, I spread the letters across the bed, arranging them carefully by date, the oldest ones at the top, the more recent ones beneath, and as I began to read through them in order, a different version of Thomas started to emerge, not the man I had lived with, but the one he had been before, and perhaps the one he had never truly stopped being. The early letters spoke of uncertainty, of choices he had not yet made, of responsibilities he felt but did not fully understand, and as the years progressed, the tone shifted, becoming more controlled, more resolved, as if he had committed himself to a path that required silence to maintain. There were references to meetings, to arrangements, to decisions that could not be reversed once they were set in motion, and each time I encountered a line that hinted at something just beyond what was written, I felt the shape of the truth becoming clearer without ever fully revealing itself. One letter, dated just weeks before Daniel was born, held my attention longer than the others, not because it said more, but because of what it implied. Thomas wrote about timing again, about how everything had to appear natural, how no one could suspect anything different from what they were meant to see, and as I read those words, I felt a quiet realization settle into place, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady and undeniable. Whatever these letters were protecting, it was not just about money or property. It was about identity. It was about roles that had been assigned without question, accepted without resistance, and lived out for decades without ever being examined. I lowered the page and sat back slightly, letting the silence of the room fill in the spaces between my thoughts, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I had never questioned before. What if the life I believed I had been building was only part of a larger arrangement, one that had been decided long before I had any reason to doubt it? I did not rush to any conclusions. That was not my way. Instead, I continued reading, moving from one letter to the next, letting the pattern form naturally, letting the connections reveal themselves without forcing them into place. Hours passed without my noticing, the light outside fading gradually until the room was lit only by the soft glow of the lamp beside the bed. And still I read, still I absorbed, still I allowed the truth to take shape in its own time. At some point, I heard footsteps in the hallway, a pause outside my door, and then silence again, and I knew Lauren was there, listening, measuring, trying to determine how much had changed, but I did not react. I did not move, because the most powerful position I could hold now was the one she did not understand. And as I reached the final letter in the stack, unfolding it with the same careful precision I had used for all the others, I realized that whatever had been hidden for 40 years was no longer hidden at all. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be used. The final letter was different from the others, not longer, not more detailed, but heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the paper itself and everything to do with the certainty behind the words. And as I read it, I realized that Thomas had not been writing to explain himself. He had been writing to prepare for a moment he knew would come long after he was gone. There was no hesitation in the way the sentences were formed, no uncertainty left between the lines, only a quiet, deliberate acknowledgement that what had been set in motion could not be undone, only revealed. He wrote about protection, about ensuring that what he had built would remain intact until the right person understood how to claim it, and for the first time, there was no ambiguity about who that person was meant to be. It was not Daniel. It was never Daniel. I lowered the letter slowly, the realization settling into place without resistance, because by then, I had already begun to see the pattern clearly enough to recognize the truth when it finally stood in front of me. Daniel had been given a role, just as I had, a role that fit neatly into the life we had lived, one that required no questions, no doubt, no deviation, and Lauren had stepped into that structure and reshaped it quietly, carefully, aligning herself with something she had discovered long before I ever suspected it existed. I folded the letter and placed it on top of the others, not separating it, not setting it aside, because it did not need to stand alone to be understood. It completed something that had been forming all along. Outside my room, the house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that no longer felt peaceful, but watchful, as if every movement carried meaning even when no one was speaking. I gathered the letters together and returned them to the box, but I did not take them back to the attic. I placed the box inside my closet instead, not hidden, just moved, repositioned, because control does not always require secrecy. Sometimes it only requires placement. The next morning, I woke with a clarity that felt unfamiliar but steady, not driven by emotion, not clouded by anger, but guided by a simple understanding of what needed to be done. At breakfast, I sat across from Daniel and Lauren as I had so many times before. The table set the same way, the coffee poured the same way, the routine unchanged on the surface, and I allowed the conversation to unfold naturally, letting Daniel speak about his plans for the week, letting Lauren respond with her usual measured tone, her usual careful balance of warmth and restraint, and I listened without interruption, without challenge, because there was no need to disrupt what they believed was still intact. When the moment felt right, not forced, not sudden, but inevitable, I set my cup down and asked Daniel a simple question, one that would not have seemed unusual under any other circumstances. I asked him if he had ever gone to see Martin Green on his own, without me, without reason, just out of curiosity about his father's affairs. He paused, just for a second, and in that second, everything I needed to know was already there. He said no, that he had never needed to, that everything had been handled, that there was nothing left to question, and I nodded as if I accepted that answer, turning my attention briefly to Lauren, whose expression had not changed, whose posture remained composed, but whose eyes held something sharper now, something that acknowledged the shift without addressing it directly. I did not press further. I did not reveal anything, because the truth was no longer something I needed to prove. It was something I was ready to use. And as I finished my coffee and stood from the table, leaving them to their conversation, I understood with complete certainty that whatever they believed they controlled in this house, it was already beginning to slip, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to stop: awareness. That afternoon, I returned to Martin's office with a folder in my hands, not the original letters, but copies I had made that morning, each page carefully preserved, each detail exactly as it had been written, because some truths are too important to risk losing, even for a moment. He did not seem surprised to see me again, not after the look I had given him the day before, the kind of look that tells someone you are no longer asking questions, you are making decisions. I placed the folder on his desk and told him I was ready to proceed, not explaining further, not needing to, because he already understood the structure Thomas had set in place, and more importantly, he understood what it meant now that I did too. The process was not dramatic, not loud, not rushed. It was precise, methodical, the kind of work that happens quietly in rooms where outcomes are decided long before anyone else realizes something has changed. Documents were reviewed, signatures were placed, instructions were updated, and with each step, I felt the balance shift, not in a way that could be seen from the outside, but in a way that could not be undone once it was complete. When I left his office, the folder was lighter, not because it held less, but because what it represented had already been set into motion. Back at the house, everything looked the same as it had that morning. Lauren in the kitchen, Daniel in the living room, the routine intact, the surface undisturbed, and I moved through it just as easily as before, greeting them, setting my bag down, taking my place in the space they believed was still theirs to manage. Lauren asked if I needed anything, her tone soft, measured, and I told her no, that everything was exactly as it should be, and for the first time, that was not just something I said to keep the peace, it was something I knew to be true. Dinner that evening was quiet, not tense, not uncomfortable, just ordinary in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was holding steady for what was coming next. I let the conversation pass without interruption, let Daniel speak, let Lauren respond, let the rhythm continue as it always had, and when it was over, I stood and gathered my plate, carrying it to the sink without waiting, without asking, because there was no longer any need to follow the patterns that had once defined my place here. Lauren watched me. I could feel it without turning, the slight shift in her attention, the subtle awareness that something had changed even if she could not yet name it, and I allowed that uncertainty to settle, because it was the only signal she was going to get. Later, in my room, I opened the drawer one last time and looked at the letters, not with questions, not with doubt, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what they had given me, not just the truth, but the timing. I closed the drawer gently and turned off the light, letting the room fall into darkness, and for the first time in years, I did not feel like I was living inside a story someone else had written for me. The next morning, when the phone call came, it did not surprise me, not the timing, not the tone, not even the silence that followed on the other end before a voice finally spoke, careful, uncertain, asking for clarification about changes that had already been made. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain. I simply confirmed what needed to be confirmed and ended the call, placing the phone back on the table with the same steady calm I had carried through everything else. In the kitchen, I could hear Lauren moving, faster now, less measured, the rhythm of her steps no longer perfectly controlled, and I knew she had received the same call, the same information, the same realization that whatever she had been building toward had just shifted beyond her reach. I walked into the room and met her eyes, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more final. Understanding, because they had both believed I was the last to know, and that had been their first mistake.